Nobody talks about the moment Hitler's hands started shaking. Not in 1939. Not in 1940. Not when France fell in 6 weeks. Not when London burned every night for months. His hands started shaking in 1941. Because of one man. A man born in a small town in Georgia. Not Georgia the American state. Georgia the country. Deep in the mountains of the Caucasus. A place so poor, so brutal, so forgotten by the rest of the world that most people who were born there died there without anyone ever knowing their name. This man was different. This man would go on to rule the largest country on earth with an iron fist so tight that even his closest allies were terrified to breathe wrong in his presence. His name was Joseph Stalin, and Hitler was afraid of him. Not at first. At first Hitler laughed at Stalin, called him a peasant, called the Soviet Union a rotten structure that would collapse the moment Germany kicked the door in. Hitler had said this to his generals. He was confident. He was certain. He was wrong, because Stalin was not what Hitler thought he was. Stalin was not a bumbling Soviet bureaucrat. He was not a weak ideological dreamer. He was something far more dangerous than that. He was a man who had survived things that would have destroyed anyone else. Prison, exile, betrayal, assassination attempts, political purges. He had lived through all of it and come out the other side harder, colder, and more ruthless than before. To understand why Hitler feared him, you have to understand where Stalin came from. Joseph Vissarionovich Djigashvili was born on the 18th of December, 1878. His father was a cobbler, a drunk, a violent man who beat his son regularly. His mother was deeply religious and worked herself to exhaustion to keep the family alive. They were poor in a way that is difficult to imagine. The kind of poor where hunger is not an occasional visitor but a permanent resident. The young Stalin was a sickly child. At age 7 he contracted smallpox. It left his face permanently scarred. At age 12 a horse-drawn carriage struck him and damaged his left arm so badly it never fully healed. For the rest of his life his left arm was slightly shorter than his right. Most children who grow up like this become victims of their circumstances. Stalin became something else entirely. He was brilliant in school. Sharp, fast, competitive. He won a scholarship to a seminary to become a priest. His mother was overjoyed. She had sacrificed everything for this moment. Her son was going to serve God. Instead, her son discovered Karl Marx. And everything changed. He started reading revolutionary literature in secret. Started organizing. Started agitating. Got expelled from the seminary. Joined the underground revolutionary movement. And from that moment on, Joseph Stalin committed himself completely to one thing. Power. Not ideology. Not the workers. Not the revolution. Power. He robbed banks to fund the Bolshevik movement. He organized strikes. He was arrested multiple times by the Tsar's secret police. Exiled to Siberia multiple times. And multiple times he escaped. Every time they tried to break him, he came back harder. By the time the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, Stalin had already spent years building a reputation as someone who got things done, someone who was loyal to Lenin, someone who was quietly, methodically, making himself indispensable. Lenin didn't fully trust him. In his final writings, Lenin actually warned the Communist Party about Stalin, said he was too crude, too dangerous, recommended removing him from power. Lenin died before he could do anything about it. And that was the last mistake anyone would make when it came to Joseph Stalin. Within a few years of Lenin's death, Stalin had outmaneuvered every single rival. Trotsky, the brilliant military mind of the revolution, was exiled and later assassinated with an ice pick in Mexico on Stalin's orders. Every other competitor was either imprisoned, executed, or broken into submission. By 1929, Stalin was the undisputed ruler of the Soviet Union, and he ruled it like a man who had spent his entire life being told he was nothing. The collectivization campaigns, the gulags, the Great Purge of 1937 and 1938, where Stalin executed or imprisoned virtually the entire senior leadership of the Red Army, generals, commanders, experienced officers. Gone. Thousands of them. Hitler watched all of this and smiled. He told his generals the Soviet military was finished. Leaderless. Disorganized. A hollow shell. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, and for the first few months it looked like Hitler was right. The Red Army collapsed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and captured. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken in single battles. The Germans advanced faster than almost anyone thought possible. By October 1941, German soldiers could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. Everyone thought the Soviet Union was finished. Everyone thought Stalin would flee. Stalin did not flee. And that is where everything changed. On the 16th of October, 1941, Moscow was in a state of complete panic. The German army was less than 100 kilometers from the city. Government offices were being evacuated. Officials were burning documents. Civilians were flooding the roads trying to escape. Looters were already breaking into shops and warehouses. The city was on the edge of total collapse. Stalin's own inner circle expected him to leave. They had prepared a special train. They had packed his belongings. Everything was ready for the Soviet leader to evacuate east, deep into the country, far from the German advance. Stalin went to the train station. He stood on the platform, and then he turned around and went back to the Kremlin. Nobody fully understands what went through his mind in that moment. Some historians believe he calculated that if he left, Moscow would fall and the psychological collapse of the Soviet Union would be complete. Others believe he simply refused to show face. Others believe he had made a cold, ruthless calculation that Moscow could be held and that holding it would change the entire course of the war. Whatever the reason, Stalin stayed, and Moscow did not fall. The Germans were stopped at the gates of the city in December 1941. It was one of the first major German defeats of the entire war, and it happened because Stalin made a decision that nobody expected him to make. But here's what Hitler still did not understand about Stalin. Staying in Moscow was not the most dangerous thing Stalin did in 1941. The most dangerous thing he did was much quieter, much less dramatic, and it would take years for its full effect to be felt. While the German army was advancing and the Red Army was being destroyed in the west, Stalin was doing something extraordinary in the east. He was moving entire factories, thousands of them, industrial plants, steel mills, weapons factories, tank production lines. He had them disassembled, loaded onto trains, and transported thousands of kilometers east beyond the Ural Mountains where German bombers could not reach them. It was one of the greatest logistical operations in human history. Within months, those factories were producing again. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, ammunition. The Soviet industrial machine that Hitler thought he had destroyed was rebuilding itself deeper inside the country faster than anyone thought possible. And Stalin was getting help. From America, through the Lend-Lease program, the United States was sending the Soviet Union enormous quantities of supplies. Trucks, jeeps, food, communications equipment, thousands of aircraft, millions of boots. Stalin never publicly thanked America for this. He could not afford to. Admitting that the Soviet Union needed help from a capitalist nation did not fit the image he was carefully constructing. The image of a Soviet Union that was winning on its own. Because image was everything to Stalin. He understood something about war that Hitler eventually forgot. War is not just fought with weapons. War is fought with belief, with morale, with the willingness of ordinary people to keep dying for something even when everything looks hopeless. Stalin knew how to manufacture that belief. He invoked things Hitler could never invoke. He called it the Great Patriotic War. He brought back the imagery of Russian nationalism, of Mother Russia, of sacred soil being defiled by a foreign invader. He allowed the Orthodox Church to reopen. He called on the memory of great Russian military heroes from centuries past. He made it personal for every single Soviet citizen. This was not a war for communism anymore. This was a war for survival, and the Soviet people responded in a way that shocked the entire world. They fought with a ferocity and a willingness to absorb casualties that was unlike anything seen in the war in the West. Soviet soldiers fought to the last bullet. Cities were defended street by street. building by building, room by room. Leningrad was placed under German siege for 872 days. Nearly 1 million civilians died, mostly of starvation, and the city never surrendered. Hitler could not understand this. His entire theory of the Soviet Union was built on the idea that it was a fragile multi-ethnic empire held together only by fear. That once Germany applied enough pressure, it would shatter along its ethnic and political fault lines. He was not entirely wrong about the fear part. Stalin's Soviet Union was absolutely held together by fear. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, was everywhere. Soldiers who retreated without orders were shot. Order 227, issued by Stalin in July 1942, was simply titled "Not One Step Back." Behind Soviet frontline troops, there were blocking detachments, units whose sole purpose was to shoot any Soviet soldier who tried to retreat. Stalin was willing to spend human lives in quantities that were almost incomprehensible. In the entire war, the Soviet Union lost somewhere between 27 and 30 million people. Hitler had assumed this would break Soviet resistance. Instead, it hardened it, because Stalin had done something in those early desperate months of the war that changed everything. He had successfully framed the conflict not as a political war but as an existential one. Every Soviet citizen understood that German victory did not mean a change of government. It meant annihilation. The Germans had made that clear enough with their behavior in occupied Soviet territory. So there was nothing to surrender to. There was only fight or die. And then came Stalingrad, the battle that broke Hitler's confidence forever. The battle where Stalin showed the world exactly how he fought. Not clean, not careful, not by the rules. Completely, utterly, without mercy. Hitler needed Stalingrad for one reason: the name. The city on the Volga River bearing Stalin's name. Capturing it would be a psychological blow of enormous proportions. It would humiliate Stalin personally. It would cut off Soviet supply lines along the Volga. And it would open the way to the oil fields of the Caucasus that Germany desperately needed to keep its war machine running. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus began the assault on Stalingrad. What followed was the most brutal urban battle in human history. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov ordered his troops to hug the German lines as close as possible. So close that German artillery and air support became almost unusable for fear of hitting their own men. Every factory, every street, every floor of every building became a battlefield. Soldiers fought for individual rooms, for staircases, for sewers underground. The life expectancy of a Soviet soldier who arrived as a fresh reinforcement in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. Stalin ordered that the city must not fall. So it did not fall. But here's what most people do not know about Stalingrad. While the brutal street fighting was consuming every German soldier and every German reserve in the city, Stalin and his generals were secretly planning something else entirely. Operation Uranus. For months, quietly, invisibly, the Soviets had been building up massive reserves of troops and tanks on the flanks of the German position at Stalingrad. The German flanks were held not by German troops, but by Romanian and Hungarian armies. Less equipped, less experienced, less motivated. Stalin had seen this weakness. On the 19th of November, 1942, the Soviet forces struck both flanks simultaneously. The Romanian armies collapsed almost immediately. Within 4 days, the entire German Sixth Army of nearly 300,000 men was encircled inside Stalingrad. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He promised Paulus that the Luftwaffe would supply the encircled army by air. It was an impossible promise. The Luftwaffe could not deliver even a fraction of what the Sixth Army needed to survive. General Paulus sent message after message to Hitler requesting permission to break out while it was still possible. Hitler refused every time. Stalin watched all of this with cold satisfaction. He had read Hitler correctly. He had understood that Hitler's ego, Hitler's obsession with never retreating, would keep the German Sixth Army locked inside that trap until it was too late. On the 2nd of February, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers had entered Stalingrad. Roughly 91,000 surrendered, including 24 generals and 1 field marshal. Of those 91,000 prisoners, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany alive. The rest died in Soviet captivity. When the news reached Germany, Hitler declared 4 days of national mourning. For the first time in the war, the German public was forced to confront the possibility that they might lose. Hitler never recovered psychologically from Stalingrad. His generals noticed a change immediately. He became more erratic, more paranoid, more unwilling to listen to military advice, more convinced that only his personal will could turn the tide. Stalin, meanwhile, was transforming. The desperate, reactive leader of 1941 was becoming something more dangerous, more confident, more strategically sophisticated. He was learning from his mistakes in a way that Hitler was becoming incapable of doing. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front slowly, painfully, irreversibly began to shift toward the Soviet Union. But Stalin's war was not just being fought on the battlefield. It was being fought in the shadows too. Soviet intelligence was extraordinary. The spy network known as the Lucy Ring was feeding the Soviets detailed information about German military planning directly from inside Hitler's headquarters. Before major German offensives, Stalin often knew the plans in more detail than some of Hitler's own generals. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the Soviets knew the German offensive was coming weeks in advance. They had prepared defensive lines of extraordinary depth. When the Germans attacked, they ran into a prepared killing ground. After Kursk, the Germans never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. From that point, it was only a matter of time. But time meant millions more dead, and Stalin was perfectly willing to spend them, because Stalin had a goal beyond just defeating Germany. He wanted to reshape the entire world order when the war was over, and he was already planning for it. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, the first meeting between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, people who met Stalin for the first time were invariably shocked. They expected a brutal, crude Soviet dictator. What they found was a man of extraordinary self-control, calm, patient, almost charming. A man who said very little but understood everything. A man who sat quietly while others talked and then, at exactly the right moment, said the one thing that shifted the entire conversation in the direction he wanted. Churchill, who hated communism and had spent decades warning the world about Soviet expansionism, found himself almost admiring Stalin against his will. Roosevelt, whose health was failing, genuinely believed he could build a personal relationship with Stalin after the war. Both of them were being managed. Stalin was always 3 steps ahead. And Hitler, locked in his Wolfslair headquarters, increasingly isolated from reality, surrounded by generals too afraid to tell him the truth, was falling further and further behind. The man he had laughed at in 1941 was now dictating the terms of the entire war. And the end was coming, not just for Hitler, but for Europe, and for anyone who stood in Stalin's way. By 1944, everyone could see how the war was going to end. Everyone except Hitler. The Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 opened a front in the West that Stalin had been demanding for 2 years. At the same time, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration in the East, the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war. Within weeks, the German Army Group Center, over 1 million men, was effectively destroyed. The scale of German losses in the summer of 1944 was catastrophic. Hitler responded by blaming his generals. By that point, he had dismissed, demoted, or had executed so many senior commanders that the German military was running on the fumes of its own institutional knowledge. Stalin was doing the opposite. The generals who had survived the purges of 1937 and proven themselves in battle had been given increasing authority and responsibility. Men like Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, and Ivan Konev had become extraordinary military commanders, hardened by years of brutal warfare, no longer afraid to push back against Stalin when they believed he was wrong. Stalin still made the final decisions, but he was listening now in a way Hitler had long since stopped doing. As Soviet forces pushed west through Poland and into the Balkans, Stalin was not just winning a war, he was collecting countries. Every territory liberated by the Red Army was quietly, systematically converted into a Soviet sphere of influence. Local communist parties were installed. Political opponents were arrested or killed. Elections were manipulated. By the time Western leaders fully understood what was happening, Soviet control over Eastern Europe was essentially irreversible. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, With Roosevelt dying and Churchill representing a Britain exhausted and financially ruined by the war, Stalin sat across the table as the strongest man in the room. He got almost everything he wanted: influence over Eastern Europe, Soviet entry into the war against Japan in exchange for territorial concessions, recognition of Soviet borders expanded through the war. Roosevelt died 2 months later in April 1945. Churchill would lose the British general election before the war even officially ended. Stalin would rule the Soviet Union for another 8 years. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered Berlin. Hitler was in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The man who had stood before hundreds of thousands of cheering Germans. The man who had conquered most of Europe in 2 years. The man who had been certain the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks. He was 56 years old, but looked 20 years older. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He could barely walk. His mind moved between moments of terrifying clarity and complete detachment from reality. On the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself. His body was burned in the garden of the Chancellery as Soviet artillery shells fell around it. When Stalin was told of Hitler's death, he reportedly said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he should have been taken alive. Not for justice, not for a trial, so that Stalin could look him in the eye. Because this was always personal for Stalin in a way that perhaps even he didn't fully understand. Hitler had looked at the Soviet Union and seen subhumans, seen slaves, seen a people fit only for conquest and extermination. He had looked at Stalin and seen a peasant, an inferior. He had been catastrophically wrong. The peasant from Georgia had outlasted him, outthought him, outfought him, and in the end, buried him. But here's the part of the story that history tends to gloss over. The Soviet Union that emerged from World War II was not a nation that had been saved. It was a nation that had been consumed. Somewhere between 27 and 30 million Soviet citizens were dead. Entire regions had been devastated. Tens of millions were homeless. The agricultural system was in ruins. Countless towns and villages had been completely wiped off the map. And Stalin had won this victory not just by fighting the Germans. He had won it by treating his own people with a brutality that rivaled anything the Nazis had done. The blocking detachments that shot retreating Soviet soldiers. The ethnic deportations of entire peoples accused of collaboration. The Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans. Entire ethnic groups forcibly relocated to Central Asia in the middle of winter, where hundreds of thousands died. Soviet soldiers who had been taken prisoner by the Germans and survived the camps returned home to find themselves treated as traitors. Many were sent directly from German captivity to Soviet labor camps. The men who fought and bled and died to stop Hitler were rewarded by Stalin with continued repression and surveillance. The victory against Hitler did not soften Stalin. If anything, it made him more dangerous, more paranoid, more certain of his own infallibility. In the years after the war, he launched new purges. The Doctors' Plot of 1953, in which a group of mostly Jewish doctors were accused of planning to assassinate Soviet leadership, suggested that Stalin was preparing yet another mass terror campaign. He died on the 5th of March, 1953, before it could fully begin. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed to this day. Some of his closest inner circle were with him in his final hours. Men who had served him for decades. Men who feared him completely. There is a theory, impossible to prove, that some of them delayed calling for medical help when Stalin collapsed. That the men who had spent their entire lives terrified of him finally, in that last moment, chose to do nothing and let him die. The man who had outlasted Hitler, who had reshaped the world, who had spent 30 years ruling through fear and blood and iron, died alone, surrounded by men who hated him, and the world he left behind would live under the shadow of what he built for another 4 decades. That is the man Hitler was afraid of, and maybe, at the very end, he had good reason to be.